The content of this episode addresses several distressing aspects of the lives of enslaved people, including sexual violence and assault. Viewers, please take note. We're filming this episode of Study Hall in 2022, and depending on who you are or where you are in the world, freedom can mean many different things. Like, freedom might mean the ability to choose your education, be it from a 4-year university like Arizona State or a community college or vocational school. But freedom might also mean the ability to move around freely, like getting to go to your grandparents' house on the weekends or a friend's sleepover, or having the ability to travel outside of the country, or being able to speak out against actions your government is taking. It can be that personal. And while there are still ongoing struggles for freedom, many of us in the United States today might take things like education and movement for granted. But those freedoms simply didn't exist for everyone back in the 19th century, and slavery is a big reason why. When we talk about slavery in the United States, we sometimes talk about it as an institution. That means talking about where slavery existed, how slavery affected politics, and how politics affected slavery. Those are important factors to discuss because they also suggest that slavery came about and expanded because of people's choices. But slavery was also, at its core, a system, one made possible by money, power, and legislation protecting those who profited from it. And that brings us to the crux of the issue: the actual people themselves. It's just as important to discuss the experiences of enslaved people in America and how they reacted to, resisted, and survived slavery. I'm Dr. Danielle Bainbridge, and this is Study Hall, U.S. History to 1865. When we talk about 19th century America, we often treat the northern states and southern states as two completely different places. We think of images of large plantations and hot, sticky summers in the south versus mills and cold, dark winters in the north. But starting in the 17th century, all of the American British colonies passed slave codes, which were a series of laws that laid out what activities were considered legal and illegal for enslaved persons. Each colony had its own slave codes that were passed by all-white legislatures. And after the American Revolution, many of these slave codes continued to exist and were intensified in several places on the state level. The institution of slavery and the laws and violence that supported it touched every aspect of life. Family life depended a lot on the region and agrarian activity, or the type of crop cultivated by enslaved persons. That might be cotton in Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama, rice in the Carolinas, or tobacco in Virginia, among other crops. In the regions growing cotton, large plantations needed a lot of labor, which meant large numbers of enslaved persons lived on the plantation. And often enslaved families lived together on the same plantation, though they faced the constant risk of having family members sold, as well as the risk of injury and death because of the conditions of enslavement. But in the Chesapeake region in Virginia, tobacco was the common crop, requiring fewer enslaved people to live on a single plantation. This meant that partners could often marry abroad, which meant marrying someone who lived on a different plantation and spreading out families. And though they were married, enslaved couples that ended up marrying abroad were rarely free to see each other as they wished. Not to mention that generally, these marriages weren't considered legally binding, which means enslaved families could still be, and often were, broken up. Enslavers could still sell enslaved people off to other plantations far away, regardless of the family ties. And when you can't move around and travel freely, you can't see loved ones. Basically, enslaved persons were often isolated from parts of their families, which was a significant obstacle to creating any community. So regardless of where they lived or whether they grew cotton or tobacco, the marriage and family life of enslaved people was severely limited. Gender also played a significant role in shaping the lives of enslaved people. In all communities, there were shared experiences, and people lived lives defined by things like status, religion, and individual choice. But in all communities, women also shared some experiences because they were women. That's true in communities of enslaved people too. Many times, these were particularly difficult and horrifying experiences, including sexual exploitation, assault, and rape. For instance, there wasn't a single law in any slaveholding state that prohibited an owner from sexually exploiting an enslaved person, and the myth of the hypersexualized African woman was often used by white men to justify the assault and rape of enslaved women, from young girls to adults. And of course, children were born from these rapes. The slave code laws changed the rules of inheritance, which typically said that a child inherited the status of their father, to instead say that children inherited the status of their mother. In other words, the children of enslaved women are themselves born enslaved, regardless of who their father is or the color of their skin. Many mothers were often forced back to work shortly after giving birth, and motherhood became yet another responsibility in addition to their daily labor. In fact, for many of these women, motherhood added to their daily labor. They were expected to serve as wet nurses to the children of the enslavers, not just their own children. Although the transatlantic slave trade was abolished in the US by 1808, which meant enslaved people could not be transported to the United States from Africa after 1808, slavery continued to expand in the US. That might seem a bit counterintuitive, but slavery engulfed entire families, and as we just mentioned, the children of enslaved persons were also enslaved. In fact, the end of the slave trade saw the wealth of some plantation owners grow, as the price they could claim for the people they held in bondage grew. And enslaved people were still bought, sold, and moved great distances inside the United States, as the institution grew in power and expanse along with the new nation. And this growth can be particularly tied to one thing: cotton. Cotton is incredibly labor-intensive to pick by hand and was hard on the soil. So by the late 1700s, cotton was becoming a lot less popular to grow. This was one of the reasons that at the time of the Constitutional Convention, some founding fathers thought that slavery would die out because it would become, even setting aside morality, a less desirable way to pursue wealth. But then came Eli Whitney, an American inventor whose work would end up revolutionizing farming and machinery. In 1794, he received a patent for the cotton gin, which was a machine that separated cotton seeds from the actual crop. And it did so rapidly. Suddenly, the amount of cotton that could be produced went up exponentially. With the cotton gin, 50 pounds of cotton could be processed in a single day, whereas before only 1 pound of cotton could be processed in a single day. And at the same time, Great Britain's demand for cotton exploded. That's because Britain was in the middle of its Industrial Revolution, with textile mills turning the raw American cotton into manufactured goods. Soon, the United States was by far the world's biggest supplier of white gold. And though Whitney hoped his machine would reduce slavery, the new demand and profits pushed cotton plantation owners to look for new ways or places to expand business. Around the same time, the US was also rapidly expanding physically. In 1803, the US purchased the Louisiana Territory from the French, which included parts or all of 13 future states and doubled the country's land size. And 45 years later, in 1848, the US grew again with land Mexico ceded at the end of the Mexican-American War. Suddenly, there was plenty of land to expand cotton, and by extension, slavery. We often think about the people moving west in the mid-19th century, wearing coonskin caps and blazing a trail towards the Pacific as they tread over indigenous lands. But below a particular latitude line, many of these people were enslaved Black people, forced to work the land and grow cotton as the country expanded. Despite a complete lack of freedom and liberty, enslaved persons found ways to resist their situation. Some broke tools which caused work stoppages, many left or at least tried, others resisted by maintaining a sense of community among other enslaved persons despite all of the obstacles, from slave codes to forced movement. Remember, enslaved persons initially came from well-established societies and cultures in Africa. They brought their native folklore and other cultural resources and fused them with the traditions of enslaved people from other parts of Africa, indigenous Americans, and even white American traditions. Those included things like how to grow rice effectively, and stories in which an apparently powerless character such as Brer Rabbit outwits everyone else. One of the most obvious forms of resistance came in the form of armed rebellion. In fact, historians have identified that there were between 250 and 313 North American revolts by enslaved people between the 17th and 19th centuries. One of the most famous revolts was Gabriel's Conspiracy. In 1800, an enslaved person named Gabriel planned to march on Richmond, Virginia's capital. Gabriel, who was literate at a time that only 5% of enslaved people in the South could read, managed to gather about 1,000 enslaved people for his revolt. But on the day of the revolution, a terrible storm struck Virginia, washing out roads and making travel difficult. Gabriel was later portrayed by Pharaoh, a fellow enslaved person who went to white authorities with the revolt's plans when the washed-out road seemed to threaten any chance they had at success. In 1831, Nat Turner led another rebellion in Virginia. He and 70 fellow enslaved persons killed 55 to 60 white people in southeastern Virginia. The Virginia militia put down the rebellion, but Turner eluded capture for a month. Eventually, Turner and 21 others were brutally executed for the uprising. In response to uprisings like these, white people often enacted even stricter slave codes, further eliminating any shred of liberty and personhood left. Southern states also passed laws preventing enslavers from freeing the people they enslaved, in an effort to prevent the growth of communities of free Black people, which white Southerners believed were likely trying to aid enslaved people in seeking their freedom. Those decisions profoundly affected the lives of enslaved people. When faced with having their freedom stripped away, they maintained their humanity by preserving their culture and rebelling against a system which promised freedom for all but reserved it for some. What we've included here is only a small peek into the lives of enslaved people. And while we will continue to talk about slavery as an institution, it's important to remember the people who make up that history and their experiences not so long ago. During the next few episodes, we'll continue to discuss the changing American landscape as we head towards the American Civil War and the enduring fight for freedom. Thanks for watching Study Hall U.S. History to 1865, which is part of the Study Hall Project, a partnership between ASU and Crash Course. If you like this video and want to keep learning with us, be sure to subscribe. You can learn more about Study Hall and the videos produced by Crash Course and ASU in the links in the description. See you next time.